Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a Mapping the March seminar. And it's a great delight to have with us today Professor Jackson Armstrong from the University of Aberdeen. Jackson has a personal chair in history at Aberdeen, and he's done a lot of work on the Anglo-Scottish Marches, which is what he's talking about today. But he's also done some really interesting digital research on the urban records of Aberdeen. And he's had a number of funded projects, which has enabled him to create a digital edition of the medieval Aberdeen records. And the website is called Aberdeen Registers Online, 1398 to 1511, really important resource. Jackson also has an interest in creative responses to research, especially video games, and he's actually invented a video game called Strange Sickness, which came out in 2021 about the plague. And he's looking for more opportunities to create new games in order to reach wider audiences. So today, Jackson is talking to us about the surnames and other expressions of kin solidarity in the Anglo-Scottish Marches before 1498. Thank you very much, Jackson.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to stand here and then I can...
I think you might just click the share screen button for people online, sorry.
Do you share screen from here? Okay, yes. Right. Share. And then I'll just share this. Yeah. And then I need to maximize, am I right?
Yes.
And slideshow from begin. Is that displaying happily?
That's great. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. And that's all. Trust folks can see there and see here, so I can see my notes. So thank you very much, Helen. Wonderful to have that kind introduction and the invitation to come to speak today. I think that one thing that your words make me think of is the extent to which all the work we do is so often in collaboration with others. And actually, it's really wonderful to have a colleague from the Aberdeen project, one of our, in the grant, which we held from 2016 to 2019. Anna Haviga was one of our research fellows in that project. And she's now gone on to permanent post here in German. I'm so pleased to have a chance to see you and to come today. So nice to see you again. And thank you, Helen, for the opportunity to come, and this is my first time in Bristol as well.
Wow! So
this is a great chance to see the city and to meet folks here and connect. And so thank you all for coming and joining today, and also Abby for making the arrangements, which have been so smooth. And I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak to you this seminar series for this project, and to connect here in some of the things I said at the outset were around the way in which this project brings together different disciplines. And so thinking about all of the exciting conversations that happen through the intersection of different subjects and being able to think about the ways in which the Anglo-Scottish Marches and this issue of kinship can be of interest to a range of subjects. The request I had was to offer a talk broadly related to border cultures and identities. So I've chosen to focus on one particular theme, which is very pertinent in the history of the Anglo-Scottish Marches, which is kinship. And this is a prominent theme in my book called England's Northern Frontier, which has just had its 4th birthday. It might be known to some historians at the period. It won't necessarily be known to all who are here today, but I hope I can share something from that study which will be of interest to those through this project and its friends are investigating different aspects of frontiers and borderlands in the late medieval British and Irish Isles. Okay, let's see if we can advance a slide. So this is the book I refer to. What's the point of the book? England's Northern Frontier. Just briefly to set out its 2 main aims in this book. It was to investigate the far north in light of the far north of England, in light of its prevailing reputation as different from the rest of England, an alien, turbulent, and exceptional periphery distant from the realm's heartland. It's often characterized in these ways. The question pursued in the book is how local society governed itself, and in particular, how it sought to manage conflict. And the second aim of the book was perhaps the more ambitious one, which was, while drawing local, national, and international comparisons where relevant and helpful, I wanted the book to raise questions from this particular example about the geography of power and the nature of conflict in the English kingdom as a whole. And this is a map of the marches, which shows us here the South Scotland in the later Middle Ages, the north of England, and the three counties that the book particularly focuses on are Northumberland, Cumberland, and Westmoreland. Pennines in the middle, being a significant topographical divider, but there are ways through. These were the three counties and the liberties contained within them that were the focus of the book, which was set out to do a kind of anatomy of the local society of these counties. These were the territories that were included in the English marches towards Scotland, which had been under the governance of a march warden from the 14th century. And by the 15th century, there were normally three marches. There was the West March, the Middle March, and the East March, each with its own warden, a crown-appointed official who was in charge of the administration of law, according to March law, which has both an international and domestic face within that territory, but also the military defense of that territory. So this is some of the structures which are might be familiar to those who have read about these spaces in the later Middle Ages. But, and I think this is important, is the focus of the book, and what I'm trying to draw on today is an effort to use a local and regional study, in this case, of these three far northern counties of England, to say something about the rest of England too. So this is about the power of borderlands to tell us about the territories that they encompass. And it is, I think, important to bear in mind that this project began long in the past as a postgraduate, well, actually first as an undergraduate project. It grew over time, and it has had a broader umbrella framework as a comparative Anglo-Scottish project. But this book emerged as a way to say something to principally an audience of historians of England about what I think this far north of England can tell us about the rest of the kingdom, and to raise questions about that. So the thesis in a nutshell is the following. Yes, the far north is different in some ways from what we know about other parts of England, but a focus on ideas of center and periphery, as is so often evident in the historiography of England and of this region, to explain these differences isn't very helpful. And at worst, it can become a distraction. Also, a focus on the militarized border as a way to explain differences found in the far north and the rest of the kingdom, I don't think is particularly helpful either. Instead, what I argue is that the distinctive features of society in the three northernmost counties are to be explained by deeper cultural patterns, especially with regard to the importance of kinship and patterns of conflict. This meant especially that royal justice exercised through the common law and its courts wasn't the sole or even the primary framework for handling conflict. Instead, we can find other normative frameworks, in part those related to the European-wide phenomenon of feud, at work in this part of England. But that argument ends with a question that I'd like to frame as an invitation. Can such patterns found in the far north of the realm tell us anything about the rest of England? And today I want to focus in on some expressions of the importance of kinship in the region to pursue that agenda. Okay. I want to begin with some general observations on kinship in the English far north. I won't go into particular depth with these observations. And what I'm working up towards in a few moments is an opportunity to speak about these two particular typologies of how the strength of kin identities were expressed in this region. So first, some general observations to lead us up to this, which is that members of landowning society in these counties, as we might expect, were in many ways typical of what we might find elsewhere in England. They were concerned to promote and maintain the vertical lineage of their family, which had brought them the inheritance of their landed estates. You can see this in the way land settlements are often made within generations of families. But they were also extraordinary in a number of ways too. And those ways broadly come under three headings. One is that they made exceptions for their allegiance to their kinsmen when they were writing indentures of retainer particularly in the 15th century. There isn't a tremendous amount of evidence for this, but for indentures of retainer, which were bonds between lords and their men who formed part of their affinity, in this case, with a relationship formalized through a written document and a contract of payment, which is the evidence that survives for us to see, there are a number of exceptions where kin relations are included in the clauses which say, so my allegiance to the Lord above all else, the king excluded, and also these particular relatives, right? We don't see that in other examples of the text of indentures of retainer in the same period in other parts of England. So that's one. Number two, although what I said at the moment about these families tending to be typical in property settlements to preserve the vertical lineage of the family, they do make provision for more distant relations in the settlement of these properties. So thinking about the way in which they seek to endow cadets and to enumerate the wider horizontal kin group in some quite elaborate land settlements, which note the names of who should inherit if the principal heir fails to produce an heir as expected. So naming quite widely into the horizontal kin group the other relations who would benefit should that line fail. And a third area of some difference is a reliance upon cadet branches of the family in the wider cousinage, particularly amongst lesser landowners, engaged in episodes of local disputing. So when fighting happens and people end up arguing over property or rights and privileges and violence occurs, as we can see often in legal records, that you can trace the role of that wider cousinage in these episodes of violence. And that's something which in the rest of England is much less likely to be seen, much more likely to, from what we know from other local studies in the rest of England, neighbors, friends, and local associates might be the ones who ally themselves in episodes of local disputing with the principal party. So these patterns are especially seen among landed families in Westmoreland and in northern Northumberland. We're going to come back to that geographical distinction in a moment, as we see that come out in what I'll talk about today. Looking at expressions of kinship in the region, having set out some of those principal areas of exception, there appear to be two typologies of very strong kinship solidarities that are in evidence. And the first of them is what I've called on top here, the double patronyms. That is to say, the use of names, personal names, that are written in the form William Atkinson Dixon. So that's the example which is here on screen. We'll say a little bit more about that and ways into thinking about it. Second typology that I'll focus on today is the use of certain cognomina. So what we could think of as second names, use that, try and find an alternative word for a surname, because surname is a loaded term in this context. The cognomina used by those whose activities and associations are highly suggestive of having been antecedents of the riding surnames, which are so prominent in particularly the 16th century records of the Anglo-Scottish Marches. Both these naming forms were concentrated in different parts of the marches, and in both cases, they were part of a more diverse field of personal naming practices. And these are the two main I'd like to pursue a bit further with you today. Okay, so this is to move us into a bit more depth on this first typology. And I want to preface this with some more general comments on naming practices, patronymics, and the use of what I call here double patronyms. So first, there is a need to caution ourselves when we're doing anything with late medieval surnames. The later Middle Ages, especially in Northern England, were a transitional period in the use of what we might think of from our modern perspective of surnames. The period was by no means one where the assumption was that individual people would have and use a fixed hereditary surname. This is much more likely to be true the higher up the social scale you go in this period, and much less likely to be true the lower down the social scale you go in this period. But even in the upper rungs of the peasantry, what we could think of as the yeoman class in this period, there's quite a lot of fluidity, which continues through the 16th and even into the 17th century in the region. And this is by no means a specialism. Naming studies is a really rich field of endeavor, and wonderful work. David Postles in particular comes to mind, have focused on this area of investigation. But I think the key thing to bear in mind is just a general note of caution when we're trying to read meanings into late medieval cognomina or surnames. What is my corpus? The key corpus of data for personal names in this study is 6,500 personal names that I gleaned from the jail delivery rolls of the early 16th century in those three northern counties of England. So that's 6,500 personal names. And what are these rolls? Well, the jail delivery rolls, these are records of cases that were heard before royal justices who held their sessions once a year. It happens. They were meant to come more frequently, but they were royal justices who came to the local counties and tried local cases of felony. So plenty of evidence for people from the peasantry, particularly the yeomanry, ending up coming before these justices and having their cases decided by local juries. The corpus of names from the jail delivery rolls reveals that across the collection here, cognomina that end in son, so what we might think of as a surname ending in son, appeared at a remarkable rate of just under 1 in 4. So about a quarter of the population who appear in these jail delivery rolls are using a surname. That's typical, and most people are using a name in this way, and that it is a name that ends in son. Broadly similar proportions in all three counties. Actually, it's a little bit lower in Northumberland, a little bit higher in Westmoreland, and almost spot on 25% in Cumberland. And it's hard to tell if these son surnames represented genuine patronyms or fixed hereditary surnames when they were being used. There are some examples, though, with internal evidence of genuine patronymic usage that can steer our interpretation. So, for instance, we do get the mention, not on screen here, but I'll read it out, as Thomas Johnson, the son of John Tomlinson. Now, this is an example that comes from west of the Pennines, but that sounds pretty clearly as though Thomas Johnson, son of John Tomlinson, is using Johnson as a genuine patronymic. And we could presume, potentially, that John Tomlinson, the father, is a son of Tom, but we don't have other evidence. Westmoreland Westmoreland as a county presents by far the highest rate of cases with such internal evidence for genuine patronymic usage. And it also provides examples of two-part compound names, such as the yeomen who use names like this: Richard Jackson Lamb and John Richardson Winter. Okay, so these kinds of names, it might be reasonable to conjecture that they described a family relationship by adding a patronym to a hereditary surname. That's plausible, right? Is Winter a hereditary surname, and John Richardson means that John's the son of Richard? It's possible. Furthermore, we can say more about Westmoreland. It was also the county which produced the highest rate of compound names with double patronyms. So that is to say, the example on screen here, William Atkinson Dixon, where you've got two son names, two double patronyms. Now, we also get, and this is a important reference in terms of the way I think this helps us to figure out how we might read names like this, these double patronyms. This reference for a person, a woman called Idonia, John daughter Amison, who also appears in Westmoreland at this time. So drawing especially on that name and the names of apparently related yeomen who are listed together in some cases. The argument I make is that the intended direction of reading in such compounds is forwards with the text, right? Because the problem would be, well, so William Atkinson Dixon, if any of that is a genuine patronym, what's potentially the father or the grandfather that's being referred to here? And if you read the example of Idonia, John daughter, Amison, I think this is a clue about how at least this name is intended to be read forwards with the text. So that Idonia is the daughter of John, and John presumably is the son of Emmy, right? So this is it's a good example of some of the evidence that you can use to make a case for the direction of reading. So I argue through these names, the existence for the social recognition of little agnatic descent groups of patrilineal cousins among the upper peasantry, who were reckoned through such naming practices. So what are these descent groups? Well, this group would count its parentage back 2 generations to a common grandparent. Patronyms derived from masculine forenames are represented in the preponderance of cases that are identified, which suggests that the descent group recognized in this formulation shared a common paternal grandfather, and so consisted of the patrilineal first cousins. And furthermore, from the examples detected, this phenomenon seems to be concentrated socially at the level of the yeomanry, so the elite of the peasantry at this time, or that seem to be the social group where this is used most often. So part of the far north displayed a strong expression of the strength of kinship ties among patrilineal first cousins among the upper yeomanry, but it did so in a way which is not yet well understood. Because this was not something that I expected when I began looking through this material, and it is something which I have been pleased to be able to find some parallels to in other parts of England in particular. There are parallels that can be located broadly around the Morecambe Bay littoral, i.e. from the area sort of Furness, Lancashire, Cheshire. This was an area that was orientated away from the Anglo-Scottish border. And there are also parallels in other, especially Western areas, including in Cornwall, which may yet reveal stronger similarities than differences with other parts of the kingdom. And the Cornish context is, of course, a distinctive one. But where these parallels do crop up is down the western, I seem to have skipped ahead, down the western half of southern Britain. So these patronymic naming patterns may they demonstrate the importance of kinship in local society, but they also suggest that the concept of a wider kin group sharing a surname for people like Idonia or William here was irrelevant. They don't use a fixed hereditary surname. They seem, based on the arguments made about the contextual evidence of these appearances, that they are using a form of patronymics, which is identifying this shallow patrilineal descent group, saying actually it's the cousins of the male grandfather that we're interested in. This is the group that we're trying to identify with. So they it's important to keep this in context, right? So this isn't what everyone is doing. This is a form of name that appears in the evidence. Other evidence, same social groupings, same territory, also clearly shows at the same time the apparently stable use of fixed surnames among the peasantry of the Marches. And some of those fixed names are then being used alongside patronymic bynames, like some of the Richardson Winter examples that we've seen. So there is a lot of variety, but this is a particular pattern which comes through, which is of note, and this is one which is from this particular region are focused on, but it's not especially orientated towards Scotland in the southwest of this region. Okay, we'll come back to that for discussion. I'm interested in thinking about your ways in which that might resonate, but and hearing thoughts about this. But I wanted to turn to our second typology of kin solidarity. This should have a 2, sorry. So this is the second type that we're looking at from the evidence in this region. The turbulent reputation of the Anglo-Scottish Marches is a topic that's closely intertwined with the idea of the riding surnames, so well documented in the Tudor period, certainly on the English records, that involved in raiding, cross-border allegiances, defiance of royal authority, and this is evidenced, as I say, certainly from a paucity of clear evidence up till the 16th century in England, and also that being a time in Scotland north of the border where documentary evidence also tells a similar story, right? So from both sides of the border, you're able to see, if we look ahead into the 16th century, the role of the riding surnames in the life of the Marches and facilitating a turbulent part of the both kingdoms. As for the origins of the surnames, the routine answer is that these local kindreds emerged as a consequence of the Anglo-Scottish warfare that erupted from 1296. But if the origins of the surnames lie in the military strife of the 14th century, and certainly there was plenty of it, the first recorded use of the term occurs as late as 1498, which is the date referenced in the title of the talk. As for border turbulence generally, it has been suggested that the early Tudor policy, in the English side of the frontier consolidated or even exacerbated this phenomenon. And still, even so, there has not been much interrogation of the structures of 15th century local society in pursuit of the question of when and why the surnames first arose. They are, the riding surnames are associated with the border valleys of Tynedale and Redesdale. These were also liberties that gradually lost their autonomy as distinctive lordships, eventually coming into crown control across the 15th century. A story there which has broad parallels with Wales and the Marches, but we can come back to that. They were also strongly associated with not just these border valleys. I think this is the Upper Coquet, which is one of 3 principal valleys, so Coquet, Tyne, and Redesdale, but not just in these upland valleys, actually in the West March, in the low-lying lands around the Solway Firth. We do have a slide of that in a moment. they're also associated with borderers who lived in that region as well. And this is the earliest reference to the term surnames used in this sense in the region. It comes from 1498 with reference to a case of border turbulence in Tynedale and Redesdale. And I'm not expecting this to be big enough to be legible, but I am highlighting the use of the word surnames here. This is in a patent roll, which I had presumed, so there's a calendared version of this, which appears in Calendar of Documents Relating to Scotland, nicely translated into modern English and heavily abbreviated. I'd assumed the original was in Latin, and I was like, hey, okay, well, what's the term that they're actually using to describe the surnames here? And you know, who in the 19th century has been the editor? What has he decided to translate into surnames? So I went back with the original, and sure enough, it's in the vernacular and it's using the word surnames. So this is striking. So this is the text of the printed calendar entry, which is on screen. What can we say about this? It's a typical reference from the royal government, an order to the sheriff of Northumberland to make a proclamation that some evildoers, William Headley, I'm going to minimize this so we can read together. William Headley, otherwise called Weakspear, Hogg of Headley, his brother, Hawbreed, and 18 other people, inhabitants of Redesdale and Tynedale, who've been accused of murdering certain Scots during the truce, and who've not showed up before the March justices. If they don't surrender at Berwick within 3 days after the proclamation, Thomas Darcy, the lieutenant of the West and Middle Marches, should hold them as felons and outlaws, and so forth. They should be forfeit of their life and goods. Further, and this is where it gets juicy, it says further that the surnames of Charltons, Reeds, Headleys, Robsons, Milburns, Wilkinsons, Cressups, Dodds, Hoggs, Hunters, Oblesons, and Fenwicks, dwelling in Tynedale and Redesdale, who reset and succor these murderers, be charged on the expiry of these days to do their best to deliver them to the said lieutenant on pain of being held as outlaws and banished themselves. So this is the context in which this term appears. And what is the only thing that's exceptional about this is the description here, the use of the word surname and then the listing of these names. This kind of order is typical. You could find, reach back throughout the 15th century and find comparable references, royal government making proclamation, some wrongdoers need to be brought to justice, and then they're named. But what's changing here is that we're getting the introduction of this list of names and their identification with this term, surnames. Okay, so here's a map which helps us a little bit with this topic. This is from Graham Robb's book on the debatable land, which is a disputed territory along the Anglo-Scottish borderline in the West March, which is highlighted in gray. It's one of the areas in this map which is focusing on the Solway Firth in the western corner of the Anglo-Scottish border. So we're looking at the boundary here of counties like Dumfriesshire and Roxburghshire with Cumberland in in the detail of this map. And what's depicted here are the surnames of the West Marches with the places that they're associated with in the 16th century. What more can be said about the terminology as it's used in the 16th century? Okay, we got this reference in 1498. They've often been equated with, well, sometimes been equated with clans, but the latter is not a word, which is taken from the Gaelic clan, which appears in 15th century records relating to the Marches, either in Scotland or in England. This changes in the 16th century. Later in the 16th century, clan ends up being used in the vernacular in this way. But what we do get are 1455 in Edinburgh, a bond is made between two men who record the terms in relation to their friends and surname, right, in Edinburgh in 1455. That's not necessarily the same context in which we're thinking of surname used in the border sets, identifying this list of troublemaking families. And it's not found in Scotland. So we've got 1498 in England, but surname used in the clear border sense, Scotland, not till 1516. So actually, quite significantly into the 16th century before this terminology seems to take hold. So I do want to give you just two examples of some of these surname families. We went through some detail with examples of the double patronym name form, but I'll give you two examples, the Fenwicks and the Grahams, of border surname families and the evidence that we can find for them in the 15th century. So start with the Fenwicks. They were a Northumberland gentry family with close ties to the Percys, who were earls of Northumberland for most of the 15th century and the principal landowners in that county, as well as with territories in Cumberland. So close ties to one of the biggest magnate families in the region. Sir Alan Fenwick appears to have married no less a bride than Margaret, the sister of Henry Hotspur Percy, famous from Shakespeare, but the son of the the son of the second Earl of Northumberland, who dies in 1403. Their son and heir was Henry Fenwick, who entered Percy service in the 1430s and was involved in the administration of the marches, remaining active until his death in 1458. Henry Fenwick and his wife Joan, who was herself the daughter of a Cumberland knight, failed to produce a son. They produced 6 daughters, all of whom married into the Cumberland gentry. However, a evident male entail took his lands to his cousin, John, an esquire, who was the husband of a woman called Mary Strother, the heiress of the lands of Wallington in Northumberland. And there's evidence of an arbitration by local gentry with strong Percy connections in 1455, just after the death of the Earl of Northumberland at the First Battle of St. Albans. That arbitration indicates that John Fenwick of Wallington had been involved in a violent dispute. And he seems to have had 2 younger brothers, Roger and Thomas, who were minor Northumberland gentlemen active between the 1420s and 1450s. The Fenwicks faced misfortune under the Yorkist regime, as did the Percys for much of it, losing part of their lands to their relations by marriage in Cumberland. From the 1460s, the family appears to have fallen into some decline, holding land but showing no sign of their former authority. By the mid-1470s, the Fenwicks appear with blood on their hands and renewed Percy links. 5 Fenwick gentlemen were appealed in Michaelmas term 1474 for the death of a man called Henry Carr. These men were Thomas and George, both from Little Harley, which is beside Wallington. Robert Fenwick, lately of Rowley, and Roger and Ralph Fenwick, both of Chipchase, places in Northumberland. One of the accessories to the killing was John Widrington, Esquire of Chipchase, and Widrington was a close associate of the 4th Percy Earl. And John Fenwick was married to Widrington's sister Elizabeth. So the Fenwick family weren't to regain official influence before the reign of Henry VII. During their period of relative eclipse under the Yorkist ascendancy, they appear to have drawn upon a concentration of cadet gentlemen for support in the course of violent action. So this is an example of a Northumberland family, which we can see engage in some of the sorts of activities that we might associate with the riding surnames of the later period, but also having an arc of prominence which closely follows their allegiance, their alignment with the Percy family, prominent in the region, and who faced forfeiture for a period under the Yorkists. Okay, that's one of the two. I want to move now to the west. So back to the Solway. Here's the widening of the River Esk, an image of the Loch Mabenstone, one of the border meeting places, outdoor meeting places for some of these march courts in the west of the borders. And I want to focus on the Graham family as an example of a surname group who were not included in the list of 1498, which we saw. Fenwicks were there, but the Grahams were nevertheless prominent in the 16th century as among the riding surnames. And the case of the Grahams illustrates well how kinship ties could be constructed, reckoned, and just as easily confused or forgotten. A man called Long Will Graham is the reputed Scottish exile and early 16th century founder of the various branches of the Graham kindred along the Esk in northern Cumberland. And there's a pedigree which was prepared by an official for Lord Burleigh in the 1590s, which narrates that this Long Will Graham, about 80 years since, so 1516, came into England from Scotland and established his sons near the River Esk. And while useful to describe the horizontal relations between various branches in the 1590s, branches of the Graham kindred, it's significant it also in noting the cross-border dimension of this family. The pedigree provides a misleading or at least incomplete account of the past. It's very clear from the earlier evidence that Grahams lived in the area well before Long Will's arrival. We can see Thomas Graham having 6 cows stolen at Alstonby in Cumberland in 1418 on the River Line, halfway between Carlisle and the border. And the thief who was acquitted was described in the record as a marchman. This Thomas Graham may be the same man described as a gentleman of Linstock nearby who stood as pledge for a fine in 1430 and as a main partner for a yeoman in the jail delivery sessions of 1437. The following year, he was outlawed for failing in those obligations. And he may well have been closely related to John Graham, gentleman, dwelling on the Esk near Carlisle in 1415, who a Buckinghamshire coin clipper appealed in that period. And the compiler of the pedigree of 1596 ignored the Grahams living along the Esk that predated Long Will, and that this fact suggests that the origins of the surnames, even in their Elizabethan heyday, were not well understood and subject to fuzzy recollection or creative misremembering. Lord Burleigh's annotations on this pedigree suggest he was aware of, but confounded by, a more complicated picture of the Graham kindred. Still other Grahams can be found in the 15th century, not all described as gentlemen or other landowners, but as yeomen, and in Cumberland and also in locations in Northumberland. So the Grahams thus inhabited England's northern marches long before 1500, and in the 15th century, bearers of this cognomen straddled the social boundary between yeoman and gentleman. More notable landowners among the Grahams were to be found dwelling in the marches north of the border, concentrated in Dumfriesshire. And in particular, the family, the most prominent family in Scotland of this were the Grahams of Moskeso in Dumfriesshire, with links there to the Earls of Douglas in the 1430s and 1450s, prominent Scottish magnates. And in Ayres, which are the equivalent of jail delivery sessions, but for Scotland, Scottish Justice Ayres, records we have from the 1450s and 60s for Ayres held in Dumfries, several apparently landless Grahams came before that court and were tried for offences. And English jail delivery records reveal that 2 Scottish Grahams, called Thomas and William, had entered Northumberland to kidnap an Englishman in 1410. So thus in Scotland, the Grahams were a family of mixed status, consisting of several landed lineages with links to greater magnates, and there is evidence of Grahams in cross-border activity. As with other families examined here, there's no clear indication of collaboration, though, between English and Scottish Grahams that we can find in this period. And that's a key element of what happens in the juicy evidence from the 16th century, is being able to see that cross-border collaboration. It's very hard to see that in the 15th century. So what about conclusions that we can draw from this discussion? And I'm watching the time as well. So there appear to be two typologies of particularly strong kinship solidarities in evidence. The use of double patronyms on the one hand, and highly suggestive evidence pointing to the predecessors of the Riding Surnames of the 16th century. Both these forms were concentrated in different parts of the marches, and in both cases, they were part of a more diverse field of personal naming practices. There's little evidence that this was so because of the military pressure of an armed frontier. Rather, the surnames seem to be one expression in the region of a prevailing culture which observes strong kin-based solidarities. Yet, if the evidence suggests this phenomenon did exist in the 15th century, the surnames, the terminology which came to describe it was not in place till the 1490s. The history of the term is, of course, not the same as the history of the phenomenon. The Northern chronicler John Harding, writing in mid-century, in his text, uses the term surname in the Middle English vernacular, not in the same way that we expect it in the sense of the border families of the 16th century. Harding's chronicle, he uses it in reference to the appellations of great magnates and kings, or to the dynastic name of a landed of an earldom, like the Montagues or the Percys. That's the context in which Harding in the mid 1400s is using that word when it occurs in that text, and he's from Northumberland. This was a time when naming practices were still fluid, as we've observed, and not all in the North were using a stable hereditary second name, as we've seen. It seems a terminological jump came in the 1490s, when surname expanded its meaning beyond the sense in which John Harding had used it, to refer not merely to a form of name, but to a group of people sharing a cognomen. This sense of a group becomes more explicit in other sources from the 1490s, and some of these surnames had reference points across the border. And it's in the Scottish Justice era records, which I alluded to a moment ago, of that decade, that we see some juicy collective references, such as Le Dixons, or Le Turnbulls, Le Elwaldus, Armstrongus, and Foresters. These appear in connection with particular offenders and their accused associates. So these records are identifying groups of people by this name. And in the first case of Le Dixons from 1495, this group, who were the kinsmen of the offender Andrew Dixon, Scottish tenant in Buccleuch, they were described as the traders of Leven. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but there is a reason to identify the traders of Leven as groups of Englishmen that were resident between the River Esk and Lyne in Cumberland. The reference, therefore, might be the clearest indication of cross-border cooperation by kinsmen sharing a cognomen in the 15th century. But some of the supposed surname families, like the Fenwicks, but there are others like the Charltons and Reeds that we could show as well, had deep roots in the marches reaching back into the 13th century and progressing into associations with particularly the Percy family in the 14th and early 15th century. And they entered a period of obscurity in the 1460s and 70s to emerge again into view in the 1490s as identifiable surnames, certainly by 1498. So what evidence does survive is very suggestive that Anglo-Scottish cooperation among namesakes, as we just noted with the Dixons, occurred but went largely unrecorded. The Grahams and others like the Elwalds, Bells, or Armstrongs in England may indeed have interacted with the landowners of these families in Scotland. And the evidence of alien subsidies in England certainly reveals plentiful cross-border migration in this region. There's no equivalent source with which to identify English aliens resident in Scotland, but there's every reason to assume such traffic was too directional. All the same, the weight of evidence suggests we might not expect the reverse scenario to have been quite so probable, i.e., of a landowning family in England interacting with non-landed Scots of the same cognomen. Even so, the social structure of a mixed status kin group seems to be evident as well in parts of the English far north. And this encompassed a wide sense of shared kinship amongst distant relations that was familiar in lowland Scottish society in this period. So, all things considered, and I'll draw to a close here, the evidence for the surnames before the 1490s is modest, and much is probably hidden behind the cloak of Percy, but also Neville family regional dominance in this period. These magnates had local dealings which were not recorded by the royal government. Yet it does not seem that the surnames originated as a product of Tudor interference in the Marches. Indications of their existence can be found from the very beginning of our period. We don't find evidence that they formed in reaction to Anglo-Scottish warfare. Rather, the impression given by the sources is of a late medieval expression of an older and deeper set of ideas about kinship in a society straddling what became England and Scotland, whereby conceptions of an extended kin group came to focus on a shared hereditary second name in parts close to the border. Over time, this terminology adapted to describe this phenomenon as the riding surnames. So awareness of kin and expressions of kinship solidarities here in some ways do show similarities with Scotland. But what is more, in some cases, this point reaches beyond mere similarity to suggest actual Scottish dimensions in the example of some of the surname cases I've pointed to. And I hope that this has attempted a more comprehensive and more nuanced investigation of expressions of kin solidarity in the region, and to have shown that there are precursor antecedents of the surnames to be found across the 15th century. But it would be injudicious to see this point as anything other than a cautious one, not least when recalling that the strong sense of kinship in the region was neither simply a matter of the surnames nor of proximity to the border. The usage of double patronyms among the highest rungs of the peasantry, concentrated west of the Pennines and especially in Westmoreland, is a firm reminder of complexities around ideas of kinship. And above all, it's a reminder of the need to think in terms of kin consciousness as a phenomenon of a diverse and varied England, not simply to see this as a cross-border import. Thank you very much.